this is Bob Borchert. We're in Old Town Mariposa, and I have with me Dr. Leroy Anthony Westerling, a climate scientist from UC Merced. I'm a planner, I've told you that, I guess, city planner, and we deal with a concept called the urban wildland interface.
Right.
And wildland fires have been wildland fires up until now, recently. We've not had a major wildland fire in historical time, that have burned down town like paradise. We've had 3, maybe 4 major fires that have dramatically affect urbanized areas. The fire here in town was caught right on the edge, but
the Delweiler fire.
Yeah. If it had gone a little bit further, we could have had a whole different looking town. This, from a adaptability perspective, creates a really unique challenge for planning policymakers, city council, boards of supervisors, the state of California, where we should encourage and discourage urbanization, the kinds of fire state practices that we should put in place, try to minimize those hazards of our urban areas coming involved. Have you had much interchange with people in the state in this subject?
Well, so that's a lot of what we're doing right now is for the 5th State Climate Assessment. So I am the leader of the team that is developing all the new generations of models and data sets to support that kind of planning for the state, and from every level, local to federal. And so we have a bunch of different teams working on different types of modeling infrastructure and data sets to support those. But then we also have a working group that meets every other week, developing the scenarios that we're going to model for. So which climate conditions we're going to look at out of the whole range of possibilities that have been projected for the future, and then what population projections for the state that we're going to use, and where those people are going to be on the landscape in 2050 or 2075 or 2099, and what the development footprint is going to look like. So we're doing scenarios sort of at the extreme ends. So we have a scenario that we're planning where all the new development is basically concentrated in existing urban areas as much as possible. And at the other extreme, we have like really unregulated sprawl. And people can just build anywhere and it's all like gobbling up the landscape. And then we're doing the same thing with fuels management. So we're taking, not what we're doing currently, because we've increased the resources currently, federal and state, for fuels treatment, but taking sort of as a baseline what we were doing, say, up to like a decade ago, and projecting that sort of steady state into the future. And then contrasting that with sort of like the highest ambition scenarios for all the different state and public and private actors, right, that are managing fuels on the landscape. So public utilities, Department of Transportation, logging companies, CAL FIRE, Forest Service, Park Service, what have you. So sort of their highest aspirations of what they could do. And we're taking that and projecting it into the future. And so we'll have like these boundary conditions, you know, dense development versus sprawling development, very little fuels management compared to really aggressive fuels management. And then So we have all these models that are gonna sit on top of that and tell you like what individual fires would look like in a particular week at any time in 150 years, mapped down to 30 meters on the landscape with the vegetation changes, the fuel changes, the fire severity, how much biomass burns, what happens to the carbon, what happens to the habitat, all of it. It's a big task. And the air pollution, the health effects, it's a whole suite of outputs. But then we are using, we know people are going to have questions about like, well, how much, what if I don't have the budget to do really aggressive fuels management and I want to look, but I want to do nothing either, I want to do something in between, right? Or what if we put a community here but we don't put one there, right? And so basically by generating these really extremes, we can learn like how fire and the risk on the landscape respond to different conditions in space and in time over the next century. And then we have what we call machine learning models. These are like artificial intelligence, computer generated models that go in and are trained on the simulations and the past observations both. And they basically represent in them, in the results, everything we think we know about our landscape and fire and how it interacts with development and fuels and climate. And all of that would basically drive something like a game, right? So we're developing what we call serious games. So somebody in a planning board for Mariposa County could sit down with this on a laptop or a tablet or a phone even, and interact with it. And they can come up with their own scenario. They can say, I think it's going to not be so hot as you're saying, and we're going to really aggressively treat our fuels, and we're going to build a hotel and you know 1,000 new parcels in our county, and we're going to put them here, here, here. And they'll be able to see how that affects the fire risk for all these different things.
So do you have, are you involved in any insider trading? How is all this information?
I just want to get insurance for my house. So that's my ambition.
At a reasonable...
At any price at this point, yeah.
So, seriously, have you personally given a lot of thought to, I mean, your family, you live right here in Mariposa. You've got to be thinking about where all this is heading. And
I'm less worried about the fire risk. I think if we do the right things, we can manage reasonably well to secure our communities. I'm more concerned about water supply. And that's the concern, you know, if you have a house here and you have no water, not only might you want to leave, but how do you sell it and get your money out of it?
Right.
It basically has no value. When you look at the history of so the history of scarcity, right? So at different times in the past, there have been fears about running out of one particular resource or another. Well, that's a more recent phenomenon, but you know what I mean. And really, if you had cheap energy, like cheap fossil fuel energy, for example, you could always come up with some kind of reasonable substitute for any resource that you thought was going to be in short supply. And so all these different scares that we had were always temporary things, because the price would go up and that would spur some innovation and people had the ability to come up with an alternative. You think about how much land it takes now to produce a gallon of milk versus how much land it took 100 years ago. There's just no comparison, right? But all of those substitutions have all been predicated on really cheap energy. So if we can make the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, and they're cheap enough, you know, we can keep coming up with substitutes for a lot of things. Water is more difficult, right? Water is basically embodied electricity. It's
well,
fossil fuels on
here-
steroids.
Here's a thought, we have sea levels rising, so desal plants, obviously could, contribute to our, water resources big time, and if we have cheap energy, that's a big cost in desalination, right?
It's the big driver of cost in desalination.
But we have to build some new canals.
Well, so that's the thing. Most of our population centers are along the coast, where there is ocean readily available. And the thing is like we already charge urban water users a lot more per acre foot than what we charge agricultural users.
Yes.
So they're already, in a sense, subsidizing agriculture and the whole system. And if we can shift some of them to, so not necessarily full desal, but you know, it's if you take brackish water or water that's been used already and you're purifying it, that takes less energy and so it's less expensive than actually desalination of regular seawater, and it's probably less environmentally disruptive too. And certainly our cities generate a lot of water runoff that could be treated and reused for agriculture or for toilet to tap, you know, consumption. And that would take a lot of the pressure off of agriculture in California and also leave some of the Colorado River water for those guys in Arizona that, you know, probably don't deserve that water compared to California, but, you know. But someplace up like Mariposa, right, that's an expensive proposition to get water from somewhere else up here. And we have a limited supply.
We've always been the source.
Yeah.
And now that source is getting
Well,
skimpy.
we have a lot of dams, but a huge fraction of our water storage is actually snow. And we're going to have, in a lot of parts of the Sierras, we're expecting a lot less snow. Because warmer temperatures, earlier snow melt, the whole thing. And that means that a lot more burden on the developed water infrastructure, the dams and canals, and less water. It's not like we can just keep building more dams and there's going to magically be more water to put in them. So we have a difficult challenge.
There's another element, and just came to me. Our dams are an energy source. We convert a lot of our water resources into energy. MID now serves the Central Valley around Merced, and there's going to be a point where they're not going to be able to turn those turbines.
Well, there's water, you know, that can generate electricity. The problem is that the way it used to work is they could manage the dams for flood control independently of managing them for water supply, in a sense, because the peak flood risk came at a different time of year than sort of the time when you got to conserve the resource into the summer and help tide over supplies. And now we are getting earlier and earlier spring runoff because of the warmer temperatures, and so the need to capture that water and store it rather than send it downstream to a reservoir at lower elevation is sort of conflicting in time with the need to manage for flood control, right? So with flood control you want to draw down, and with and when if you're managing for the resource you want to maintain the levels.
Have you been up and seen Lake McClure lately?
Not in the last couple months, no.
It's got a lot worse.
Yeah.
And are the water managers or irrigation districts involved in your planning process in
Well, so the state has been changing how the water's managed, groundwater is managed with
Right.
legislation. That's not really part of my bailiwick, that's not what I do. But it's a sign, I think, you know, the seriousness of the situation, that, you know, there's always a lot of political resistance to changing anything to do with water law, right? Those are fighting words in New California or anywhere in the West. So the fact that the state has been pushing so hard on that is a pretty solid indicator of the seriousness of the situation in terms of constrained supply. Because every time we have what we call droughts, and are not really necessarily what we meant by drought 100 years ago, we're making up the difference in the southern San Joaquin especially with groundwater pumping.
With what?
Groundwater pumping. And it's not sustainable, right? The levels are going down faster and faster. And basically our old management models always just assumed that there would be more groundwater to pump and that it would be economical to do so. And the reality is that that's not going to be true everywhere. And some agricultural lands that are more marginal are going to have to be abandoned because there's not going to be enough water available from groundwater and surface sources to flush out the salts.
This growing population.
More carefully.
Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll be coming to you again with some more discussions on this subject. Bye-bye.